The Apostle Paul contributed more to the New Testament than any other writer. Now, typically, the books that he wrote were simply short letters that were sent to churches or to individuals, and they were preserved and shared with other churches and eventually collected with other sacred writings to become part of the Bible as we know it today. So I just want to take a moment and give you a very brief overview of the books Paul wrote. The first one is the book of Romans. This is Paul's masterpiece where he explains the deep need that we all have to be made right with God and the fact that this is only possible through the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross. Then he explains the practical implications for how to live out that kind of life. The second book he wrote is called 1 Corinthians. And here Paul points out the kinds of sins that churches and Christians can fall into, and he invites us to put away those sins and live a life that honors God. And after that is the 2 Corinthians, which is the second letter of Paul to the people in Corinth, 2 Corinthians. In that letter, we learn about the new covenant that we're part of in Christ, which leads to a life of worship of God and of service to other people. Following that is the book of Galatians. In Galatians, Paul demonstrates that salvation is only possible through faith in Christ, and anything that you add to that faith is a compromise of Christianity. After Galatians comes Ephesians, written to the church in Ephesus. And in Ephesians, Paul unpacks all the blessings that belong to us in Christ, and he shows us the nature of faith and the power of the church as the people of God. After Ephesians comes Philippians. This letter explains the deep joy that we should have in our life as Christians, a joy for today and a joy for the future, eternity as well. And then after Philippians comes Colossians. Colossians reveals that Jesus is supreme above everything in creation, and because of his work on the cross, we can live lives that honor God and that make a difference for others. After Colossians comes 1 Thessalonians, the first of two letters written to the church in Thessalonica. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul gives us a glimpse of the future, and he talks there about the return of Christ and how to prepare for it. Then comes 2 Thessalonians, and there Paul shares more about our future and more about the world's future when Jesus comes back again. And then the next book you'll run into is called 1 Timothy. This is written to an individual, to young Timothy. And Paul explains the organization of the church and how to organize the church in a way that will lead to maturity. And then in 2 Timothy, Paul becomes even more personal than before. This is Paul's final letter to the man that he mentored. And so it's a personal letter that shows us Paul's heart for God. Then comes the book of Titus. Titus is a letter to a young man in the church that he served that shows how that we can help each other grow to maturity. And Paul's final book in the New Testament is the letter to Philemon. Paul writes this letter asking his friend Philemon to forgive his runaway slave who has just become a Christian. And if you read all of Paul's letters, you're going to discover God's great plan of salvation, what God has done for us through his son Jesus Christ, and you'll learn all of the implications about what that looks like and how we live our lives individually and as his church.